Chapter 25. Color in the Visible and Invisible World. Conclusion. As we have found order, law, and system throughout the cosmos, there must be order, underlying Madame Blavatsky's seeming denial of it, in the numbering of the human principles. Her statement is true in the sense that the vehicle most highly developed is the most prominent one in the individual, and its color overshadows all other. Now, if we think of the predominant sheaths as representing the tonics of a scale, the septenary beginning with the tonic, the C-scale man would number from his tonic, C, and the F-sharp man from F-sharp, and color and principle would vary correspondingly. Among the repeated references to this variability of type changing the order of principles, Madame Blavatsky says, the human principles elude enumeration because each man differs from every other, just as no two blades of grass on the earth are alike. She also says, every man being born under a certain planet, there will always be a predominance of that planet's color in him, because that principle will rule in him which has its origin in the hierarchy in question. The speech of man preserves the record of time-honored recognition of this fact. We say, he has a martial bearing. His is a fiery temperament. She was always a little loony, meaning not crazy at all, but fanciful, imaginative. The very word lunatic, however, expresses the baleful effects of the moon's excessive and malign influence. Even as a child he had a lordly way. That is, Jupiterian, commanding. A saturnine disposition has its happy contrast in a sunny one. And thus, a man of iron, she is as good as gold, he has no sand, these all are significant of elemental constitution. Pages could be filled with examples of this graphic symbology which has enriched all languages, and remember that all symbology is the expression of facts and truths. In losing sight of this, the moderns have suffered much. At first the mind refuses to accept this mere preeminence of a sheath as changing its relations in kind or quality to the other principles, but it becomes possible when we realize, to use Mrs. Besant's words, that the sheaths are not divisible one from another, and that there are but three upadis in which these different principles work, that is, considered as planes of consciousness correlating man with the astral and physical, the psychic and mental, and the upper triadic or spiritual realms. Thus the physical body and its etheric double are connected with the right eye, the positive center of vision dominating the senses. The Karma Nipa and lower Monas, with the brain, and the higher triad, with the heart. The occult signification of this is, that the spirit Atma establishes centers of union for these closely allied sheaths in these organs, and the development of consciousness in the various sheaths proceeds from these centers. But this must not be considered as contradicting the fact that there are 7 states of consciousness. There is neither sameness nor monotony, but varying degrees everywhere. Lack of order exists also in the sense that none of the sheaths are above or below one another, for they interpenetrate and intermingle. Thus there is really no higher nor lower, but an eternal withinness. An example from physics will explain this most clearly. A cubic inch of water expands into a cubic foot of steam. In a glass globe of a cubic foot's capacity filled with steam, not only can boiling water be added but also alcohol, which will expand into just as much vapor as if no steam were present. After this, as much ether may be poured into the globe as if the space were not already occupied by steam and alcohol vapor. A familiar experiment with solids is to fill a bowl with peas, scatter over it mustard seed or other fine grain to fill the vacant spaces, then add salt and sugar. Just in this manner the atoms of the various human sheaths, vary by conditions of vibrating form and color, mingle together. Annie Besant says, every sphere is around us, the astral, the mental, the Buddhic, the nirvanic, and worlds higher yet, the life of the Supreme God. We need not stir to find them, for they are here, but our dull unreceptivity shuts them out more effectively than millions of miles of mere space, ancient wisdom. But granted all these irregularities and blendings one with another, there yet must be a standard correspondence of principles with tattvas, colors, tones, and numbers. To ignore it, is to lose sight of the profound influence and significance of number, to forget that it was and is through the rhythm of vibrations an unchangeable factor, with unchanging relations to the hierarchies and the principles emanating therefrom, because numerical relation is inherent in form. In the sense of progression from the coarse vibrations of the physical plane to the inconceivably subtle ones of the spiritual plane, we have the mental concept in which the numbers of the sheaths must be unvarying. When we deal with involution, We may begin with Atmos 1 and count down to 7. But our immediate concern is with the evolution of the soul in its conquest of the realm of matter. We are seeking to develop its freedom and power, seeking to free our real selves from the tyranny of uncontrolled sheaths of matter, and necessarily we must begin with the lower or coarsest vehicles. Therefore, we should logically count from 1 upward to 7, and the lowest sheath should be the most completely dominant or perfected of the physical principles. The path now is a spiral progression upward and outward. Involution was a descent downward and inward. Our task is to release this inward power, not from, but through its gross material vehicles, that it may be active in all, and we must seek it within. To do this we must understand the sheaths in which the power is involved. Therefore the important point is to know them by association with their corresponding centers of physical activity, which are invariable, and with their normal colors and their tones or sounds. We must learn the separate tones first before we can combine them into harmonious chords and evolve melodies. Remember that the sounds are seen, not heard on the physical plane. Madame Blavatsky cites Exodus, in support of this, and says, when correctly translated the passage would read, and the people saw the voices, and these voices, or sounds, are the Sephiroth. Spiritual man corresponds with the higher circles, the divine prism which emanates from the one infinite white circle, the ultra-octaves of color and tone, while physical man, emanating from the Sephiroth, corresponds with the lower octave of visible color with the objective sounds that are seen, not heard. Want of agreement exists wherever many minds have attempted to formulate a part of this law of correspondences without bringing all into harmony. But this very failure is evidence of the infinite variety in the permutations of the tattvas and their alternating phases, omnipresent duality, and of the varying hues that every thought imparts to the atoms transmitting that thought or created by it, as also of different stages of development of the clairvoyant who describes the colors of these thought and sound forms. A clairvoyant may be able to see lower sheaths in an aura and not the higher ones. The lesson to us is to ignore unimportant differences which are yet mere matters of intellectual guessing, and confine our attention to the facts which affect life and happiness. The scheme of correspondences I have prepared is offered tentatively, because no authority can be quoted for it as a whole, but after much study and thought and comparing all authorities, it is the only one evolved from the tangle of discrepancies which appeals to me as logical and rational. The fundamental correspondence must be that of vibrations, and upon the coarseness or fineness of these all associations must be based. When we speak of coarseness in this connection, and especially in reference to color, it must be understood in a comparative sense. Thus, red vibrations, the largest waves of visible light, are so small that 39,000 of them grouped side by side cover only 1 inch of space. The agreement of red with the fundamental tone in music was early recognized, each being the coarsest vibration of its kind, and in the procession of octaves of both color and sound, it was found that the closest ratio of like progression existed between the tonic chord, or first, third, and fifth, and the triad of colors, red, yellow, and blue. The earnest student of the tattvas must already have perceived that this triad, predominating in the solar plexus, exercises a preeminent influence upon the functions of life. Now, nature has taken such care to prove the agreement between tone and color that she has not left us to depend solely upon the psychic vision of the clairvoyant who sees the colors of tones and voices, but through remarkable cases of sense abnormalities has furnished us with indisputable corroboration of these relations. In Berlin an operation was performed upon a man's brain which required the severing of both the auditory and the visual nerves. When the nerves were reunited they were mismated, the upper portions of the optic nerves being joined to the undersections of the auditory nerves, and vice versa. The result of this distressing blunder is that the man sees sounds and hears colors. Looking at a red object he heard a deep bass tone, and when blue was shown, the sound was like the tinkle of electric bells. But the ringing of an electric call bell produced the sensation of blue light, and listening to Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony caused a vision of green meadows and waving corn. The celebrated Italian scientist, Professor Lombroso, had an hysterical patient who lost her eyesight completely, but was able to read with the tip of her ear. As a test, the rays of the sun were focused upon her ear through a lens, and they dazzled her as if turned upon normal eyes, causing a sensation of being blinded by unbearable light. Still more puzzling to Professor Lombroso was the fact that her sense of taste was transferred to her knees, and that of smell to her toes. This abnormality is very simple to the knower of the tattvas, who recognizes these locations as centers of great activity for the tattvas corresponding with these senses, that is, upus in the knees, and prithvi in the feet. Corresponding with the above-mentioned triads of color and of tone, there is a triad of form, the triangle, cube, and sphere, or circle, and the chemical elements recognized as most closely related to these triads are respectively hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. But they are none of them simple tattvic forms, that is, hydrogen, recognized by Babbitt as the champion heat atom of the world, is a prithivic form of Tejas, carbon, a prithivic prithvi, and oxygen, a prithivic pheo. Mrs. Besant says the scientist has as yet discovered no atoms that are not of this physical or terrestrial form, all are prithivic states of matter. He has as yet no conception of the 6 higher atoms that stretch beyond. But the scientific view of the atom is rapidly changing, as we have before this had occasion to notice. Already it is recognized that the atom is a complex, not simple unit. A single atom of radium contains 160,000 electrons or corpuscles. Science is fast taking down the walls between the visible and invisible, and ere another decade is marked off on the spiral of time, the materialist will be recognized as the true degenerate. All atoms of recognized chemical elements so-called admit of 4 dissociations, or separations, to simpler, more subtle states before the ultimate atom is reached. Students, who are interested to pursue the subject further, are advised to study Annie Besant's occult chemistry, and the work of Dr. Babbitt, previously mentioned. With regard to the ether, Akasha, which pervades all space, science has at last come to this very rational conclusion, as Robert Kennedy Duncan puts it: how much we ourselves are matter and how much ether is, in these days, a very moot question, the new knowledge. Science has discovered also that absolute immobility, rest, is non-existent, that every particle, every atom of the most solid-seeming matter is in an incessant quiver, and that the velocity of the motion is constantly changing. Is not this corroboration of the tattvic law, which alone can explain the phenomenon? Think not that these details are a digression from our subject. They are, on the contrary, intimately connected therewith, for it is most important as a preparation for understanding the subtle sheaths of the body that the reader's imagination be wonted to faring forth into this marvelous world of the infinitesimally small, a clear conception of which is so much more difficult to form than of the vastness of the universe. Part 1. No problem of occult knowledge has excited more controversy than the one we must now consider, the correspondence of the principles with color and tone, and therefore with number. For myself, I think it not merely unwise but impossible to surround it with hard and fast lines. To suggest the reasonable scheme, the one that imagination can accept, and in things occult it is of paramount importance to see with the imagination, is the utmost I shall attempt. There is deep insight as well as truth in the statement that those who receive the wisdom of the past or the impressions of the present as something to have and to hold, gain absolutely nothing. That is, one must form original mental concepts of everything, receive all light, all suggestions, with open mind, but think, ever think, oneself, till more light is thrown upon the subject. The nomenclature employed in this subject, the multiplicity of names for a single sheath, betrays the difficulty experienced in defining and accurately limiting the activities and influences of the separate principles. To guard against the possible misunderstanding that these correspondences can be defined with narrow dogmatism, I shall try to ensure a broad outlook, inviting individual thought and opinion, by giving the student first a glimpse through the mental eyes of Mrs. Besant and of Rama Prasad. The former says, "It is written in the Mundakopanishad that from Brahman the one comes life." Prana is the word used. I shall show you presently that prana is atma in outgoing activity, the mind, manas, that is the second, then the 5 elements as we know them: ether, air, fire, water, and earth, 7 in all. These are the 7 regions of the universe, the 7 sheaths of Brahman, as the self of the all, the self and its sheaths. As you already know, man's sheaths correspond with these and put him in touch with the entire universe. Mrs. Besant's is a very simple classification, and clearly indicates the specific tattvic action in the 5 lower sheaths, but she follows them in descent from 3 to 7, instead of ascent. Rama Prasad looks at the subject differently but is equally clear. He gives the human principles as first, sthula sharira, gross body, 2nd, unhappy prana, 3rd, unhappy mind, 4th, happy prana, 5th, happy mind, 6th, the soul, 7th, the spirit, nature's finer forces. Thus he places karma unhappy prana and lower monas next the visible body over which their uncontrolled desires have so unhappy influence. These sheaths are those builders of karma that have so potent influence in retarding evolution. Happy prana comes next higher monas, or the causal body, these being the sheaths through the development of which the soul is released from bondage to the lower principles and attains the power to bring them into sympathetic unison with her own higher vibrations. Remember that the causal body is the chief agent in evolution, and is so called because in it are gathered the effects of experiences, which act as causes, molding future lives. But all the sheaths have their use in the economy of nature. Only their misuse renders them unhappy. Notice here that the fundamental five-fold division of body, life, the subtle sheath, mind, soul, and spirit, corresponding with the 5 lower tattvas which you know best, is expanded into the septenary by including the 2 phases of life as vitality exhibited in actions and of mind, the thoughts prompting the actions and determining whether they shall be evil or good. The scheme is somewhat misleading, however, for prana, per se, cannot be restricted to number and sheath since it is the life in every sheath. Madame Blavatsky gave emphasis to this fact, and though she gave prana a number in some diagrams, she omitted it in others. In many classifications it is included, generally as the 3rd principle, but the lowest plane of prana is compounded of the microbes of science. Fiery lives direct the constructive work of the building microbes. The coordinating power of all these sheaths lies in prana. It is through prana, by means of the nervous system that the I, the personality of the body, acts upon and through them all, and is responsible for the development of individuality as desire yields to the direction of will, and soul force becomes an active and determining principle in the life. In all schemes of correspondence there is one unvarying agreement, the relation of Mars to the fire element Tejas, and to redden the karmic sheath, or desire body, but in number it is variously considered as 1st, 3rd, and even 4th. As the body of living fire within, the Tejas sheath seems essentially the 1st, for without it life would be impossible. The lowering of normal temperature is the first cause of most disease. The preponderating influence of desires in molding the physical form, emotions changing the expression of the face even from moment to moment, and the thoughts that prompt them building character hour by hour, is sufficient reason for assigning to this sheath the lowest place in the evolutionary spiral. Of this sheath Madame Blavatsky says, it is the grossest, that is the coarsest, of all our principles. The expansive character of Tejas vibrations and their vapor-like nature, give them this marvelous permeating and molding power which enables them to enwrap the solid, cohesive atoms of Prithvi and become visible as red, and audible as dew, or middle C, the tonic of the first major scale. The lower the race, the more visible is the color of this sheath, but more of this when we study the aura. Kamic atoms are diffused throughout the blood, but are specially active in pelvis, liver, heart, and lungs. The whole trunk of the body, including the shoulders and arms, is greatly influenced by Tejas, and there are also subtle connections of this sheath with the left ear and the little finger of the right hand. The liver is the general and the spleen is the aide-de-camp. All the work which the liver shirks falls upon the spleen. This accounts for the fact that when a man's liver misbehaves, he is very apt to be spleeny, a most trying condition due to the fact that his spleen, that supposedly superfluous organ, is overworked. Of the term rupa, Sanskrit for form, to this after-death vesture of animal nature, which exists in the astral sphere for a length of time proportioned to the tenacity of the physical desires which created it. Being devoid of ethical sense, possessing only the lower animal consciousness, its rapid disintegration is the greatest blessing. Thus karma is the most material principle in the human septenary group, hence the sheath whose composite links of desires for material pleasures and experiences bind us fastest to the physical plane and retard the soul's progress. The second principle is the sthula sharira, gross body, corresponding to Prithvi, earth, through its state of matter, solid, but in color and tone, because so permeated by Tejas, with orange and re. It influences the nose, lower posterior lobes of cerebrum, the liver, and the lower limbs from knees downward. Orange has always been recognized as synonymous with physical force, and it is, Perhaps, for this reason and also as being the color of the gross body, that occultists assign this color to vital force, or prana. This, however, is not the teaching of the Shivagama. Rama Prasad, who follows the Sanskrit work, describes the positive current of prana as reddish-white, and the negative, as pure white, both being modified and tinged by the flow of the tattva at the time prevailing. This teaching is corroborated by known physiological distinctions between the sensory and motor nerves, the former the receptive and negative being bluish-white, and the latter the outgoing, positive agents reddish-gray. The Tantrists always refer to the negative, or AI, as the cooler state of life matter, which is only a shade of prana, the original state. Raya receives the impressions from the motion-imparting phase of life matter, that is, the positive phase of prana. Yellow is the color of the purest state of Prithvi, the spiritual element in the earth, its ensouled force, and predominating in the solar terrestrial currents flowing round it. Therefore, it is uncommon in the crust of the earth, which is composed of the grossest of its manifold permutations, but shines forth in its perfected things the most precious metal, the citron fruits, ripened grains, and flowers. The fragrance of flowers is a spiritual essence stimulating to the nerves and conveying direct nutriment to the soul. Yellow is a very precious color, deemed the culmination of light. I think it could be proved that the foods most valuable to mankind are yellow. The liver is most favorably affected by oranges and by herbs of a yellow or orange hue, which are also cerebral and nerve stimulants, vitalizing, therefore, to the whole system, and laxative. The more harmonious the human body becomes and the purer and higher the aims of its indwelling soul, the stronger, more electric and magnetic is the flow of the Prithivic currents through the nadis. The Sukshma Sharira, or etheric double, third principle, is under the rule of Venus, for it corresponds with Apus, water, and in color and tone with yellow and me. But, being composed of 4 grades of subtle ethers, the red and the blue principles are present to form its negative violet. The absorbent, solvent, and reflecting powers, as in a mirror, of this tattva, and therefore of the sheath, whose substances-like qualities, make it inadvisable to attempt to establish hard and fast color rules in their connection. Holding the septenary of colors latent, receiving colors from every source, and reflecting everything above and below, who can say positively that Apus is this or that? In its primary state we know it as white and colorless. But we can venture to assign it an orderly place in the scale of progression as the normal state after permutations fitting one it for physical activities. The moon is sometimes designated as the ruling planet of this sheath, but are not all negative conditions influenced by the moon? I believe it will eventually be proved that they are. Violet is the color sometimes attributed to the moon, a marvelously translucent silvery violet, the hue that silver assumes in certain conditions, and her mysterious power over water has always baffled the scientist. There are no doubt very subtle and strong relations between the moon and Venus. The spleens are the vital links between the gross and etheric bodies, for through them prana is brought forth upon the physical plane. The subtle spleen absorbs the vital currents and transmutes and changes them into the coarser particles that become in the gross body its elemental lives, animating the molecules and cells. The positive connection of these chakras, through motor nerves, is within the medulla oblongata, and the negative union, through the nerves of sensation, is in the solar plexus. Brian Sekar says, when a violent sudden emotion causes death, it is by the action on the medulla oblongata. The explanation is that the shock ruptures the union of the physical body with its double and thereby severs connection with the vital force, see chapter 22. The thoughtful reader will recall in this connection the prevalence of a power stimulator of taste in the throat. Besides these profoundly important centers, the little finger of the left hand is influenced by the etheric double, through the spleen, as is the right through the liver, the little fingers corresponding with these organs, and it is this sheath which transmits all sense perceptions to the Kama-rupa, the sheath of feeling and sensation. Hence, in the etheric double lies the mysterious power to receive them in abnormal ways, as seeing through the ears and smelling with the toes. By so much as one sense is weakened or dulled is the connection between the etheric body and its counterpart impaired. One immediate benefit derived from practicing the breathing exercise for pranidma, or control of prana, the exercise distinguished as the held breath, is that it invigorates and harmonizes all these immensely important connections, restoring them when disordered to their normal balance and union, and by so much as they are strengthened, strengthens the hold upon life itself. The psychic breath is the breath of the spirit, and we cannot limit it to the thought power setting into vibration the molecules of the nerve cells. It is also the subtle breath of the etheric body through the pores of the skin, and it is something altogether finer than oxygen and nitrogen that it inhales in this psychic breath. The purity and healthful activity of the skin thus yields in importance to no other function of life.